Engineers of Reddit. What's the most ridiculous idiot proofing you've had to add in your never-ending quest to combat stupid people? We had a pedestrian bridge next to a bridge for vehicles, separated by about a 3-foot gap. The bridges were about 20 feet high over the water. So many drunk pedestrians climbed over the rails and tried to jump between bridges and didn't make it that I was directed to design a safety net to hang between the two bridges. Commenter. I once hopped over a small wall to take a piss behind it and woke up, flat on my back, looking at the stars. Turns out there was a 15-foot drop. Luckily, there was an iron ladder that my head must have missed by inches on the way down, so I was able to get back up after I'd had my piss. Unfortunately, after I'd climbed out, I realized I'd lost my watch and had to climb back down and grub through a pile of piss-soaked leaves to find it. Same watch fell off a few years later when I fell off my bike and broke both arms. I cycled very gingerly towards the hospital, then had to ride a mile back to look for it. Bad luck watch. Story 2. Wife is a civil engineer. The one that came to mind for her was that she had to add to the specification of a construction contract that stated that workers would not drink the water that accumulated at the bottom of an excavation. Story 3. I work on cars, so almost everything is designed around protecting people. My favorite is that we have to make the HVAC system louder and engine noise insulation worse because people will complain if they can't hear the systems running. We could make almost silent air ducts, but our warranty spend would go up. My mother has OCD. She got a new Kia Sorento a few years back and loved it for how quiet it was until the squeak started. I'd be driving with her and she'd say, "That, can't you hear it? It's driving me nuts." I had no idea what she was on about. She took it to the dealership, demanded they fix it. They had no idea what she was talking about. She had a mechanic sit in her car while she drove it, and he couldn't hear a thing. He sat in the driver's side and drove, and actually could hear it then, but said it's just a normal noise the car makes. She went nuts. She's taken the car in to see multiple mechanics now, driven it out of town to see other dealerships, even tried to take it apart herself, all because the car was too quiet. Story 4. I'm a Mech E intern. I walked in on my manager discussing a design with another engineer. All I heard was, "So the guys will probably use that as a hammer, so I made it out of this stronger material. When they're working, they will probably be throwing this small door open, so I used stronger hinges and added a stop." It's things like this that I really appreciate about my internship. I likely wouldn't have thought about that myself. Commenter? One of my professors worked for years designing mining equipment and has on several occasions told us that every single design should be strong enough that the finished product can be used as a hammer without breaking because it will always be used as a hammer. Story 5. Civil engineer here. While laying asphalt, usually we close the road and cover using barricade tapes. But no matter his hard, we try people always find ways to go through and ruin the whole process. Ultimately, we had to use security to block the roads. Story 6. Former combat engineer here. We built a 3-foot-high fence across a minefield, including huge red warning triangles every 4 feet. Someone still stepped over it to go take a crap in the woods. They were carried out on a stretcher. Nothing is idiot-proof. Story 7. I worked in a call center, and all of the PCS were slung on straps under the desks. I'd love to know which genius came up with that idea. So people would be on the phone swinging back and forth in their chair and hit the power button. Then I'd get a ticket saying, "My modem keeps turning off." I disabled the power button from immediately shutting down the PC if you pressed it, but of course they'd get into a position sometimes where it'd be held down long enough to override it. Solution? Duct tape and a bottle cap. Once we upgraded all the PCS to new ones, I took the time to remove those stupid straps and put the PCS behind the monitor out of reach instead. Story 8. I have one customer that takes our product, removes the battery packs, and solders them in backwards. He cuts the wires to the batteries, then solders red to black and black to red, then calls us complaining that they don't work. There is no idiot proofing that I can think of at this point. I pretty much just admit defeat now. We can't pot them. They have replaceable AA batteries in them. They're off warranty. Every time they come back in, we bill them. They don't seem to mind. And I'm so used to this guy's shenanigans, they don't take long to fix. That first one, though, it took me forever to figure out that the power lines were reversed. It just never occurred to me. It's just not something you'd suspect. I sent him an email after a half a dozen or so of these came in backwards. Explained how red goes to red, black to black with pictures. Only had one come in backwards after that. I've always wondered what would happen if this guy ever needed to jump his car. I've designed Rev 2 of the product, with this guy specifically in mind. They use a USB-C charge port and a Li-ion battery. No need to open it up and swap A batteries now. We'll see how he responds to that. The big question, why? I have absolutely no idea what this dude is trying to accomplish. Your guess is as good as mine. Commenter? My cousin is a chemical engineer. For weeks, they had contaminants in their product. I forget exactly what fixes they tried, but they eventually found out via security cams that one of the night shift maintenance workers was pissing into one of the chemical vats. Story 9. Application engineer here. When handling a 3-days laser scanner, it has to be placed and fixed on a stable tripod. A flat rail of a balcony is not a suitable substitute for it. And no, the insurance has not covered the total loss of the device after it fell from the 5th floor to the concrete pavement. Story 10. Industrial designer here. You have no idea how many pointers I have to add to the products I make. X. I had to add arrows to a product that had 2 pieces that the client could put together and remove for cleanup. It was designed that it could only fit into one position, and it was made very obvious which position that was. Think a larger shape and hole. No, I still had to put 2 arrows in case people couldn't tell the bigger bump could only fit in the bigger gap. Story 11. I work for the utility company, mainly in the distribution of natural gas. All of the pipelines we put into the ground are either yellow or black and yellow, and only gas is allowed to use yellow for their pipes. Some of them have natural gas printed on them in big, bold letters. We put special tape about 20 centimeters above the pipeline to indicate that there is a gas pipeline below, and whomever is digging there should be careful. All these precautions and warnings, and we still get daily incidents from idiots who were digging somewhere and hit a gas pipeline. Commenter. Also work for a similar company. Worst is when an idiot doesn't call dig safe, their backhoe damages the pipe, and they just cover it up. Then we get a call for an emergency leak, dig down, and you can clearly see what happened. Backhoe teeth marks and all. Story 12. Ever write any software? The amount of error checking you have to do on any user input is phenomenal. No matter how much explanation you provide, users seem to be chimpanzees entering stuff seemingly at random. Commander, software engineer who's training me right now. I can make an application that does exactly it needs to in about a month. The hard part is making it not do what you don't want it to do. That takes 6 months. Story 13. Reminds me of one of my first design jobs. Okay, boss, I've got the design. The front footing needs to be 20 inches wide. The rear footing is 17 inches wide. So both of them are 20 inches. Why do we need a 20-inch if a 17-inch will work? Because that way we don't have to worry about the construction guys building a 17-inch front footing and a 20-inch rear footing. Story 14. I work remodeling small businesses. Our niche is we keep the business running while doing the remodel. I've caught people climbing over fences, ducking under moving heavy machinery, broke into locked doors, all to act surprised when we tell them this area is off limits and point to one of the 10 signs we posted. Commenter? I clean up crime scenes. I've had people duck under police tape lines, open the zipper on poly sheeting containment, walk through blood, and walk up to a tech wearing a Tyvek suit, gloves, rubber boots, and a full-face cartridge respirator to see what's going on. Story 15. Mechanical engineer. I work on systems that need to be light and durable, but the business guys want it cheap. This is a choose-two sort of situation, so you can probably guess what got dropped. I can't tell you how many times I've told the operators to not intentionally drop the product from 6+ FD onto concrete. Can't get specific, since it's a very niche, classified market. Commenter. Knew an engineer once who, when being obviously lied to by a salesperson, asked if the part in question had passed the Balcones test. Yes, the salesperson responded. So the engineer picked up the part in question, turned around, and threw it off the balcony. Didn't pass. Story 16. Years ago, I worked as a building engineer, glorified maintenance man, for an office building that had endless complaints about the AC, heater not working. The staff in the office would adjust the thermostat up and down all day, and then everyone else would complain it was too hot or too cold. It did not matter what kind of lock or cage I put on it. They would break and remove within a day or two of a new one being installed. So I got a new thermostat with a remote sensor and installed it in my office with the remote sensor near where the old T-stat was, and I left the old T-stat in place with low voltage power so that it would appear to function. Then I let them change the temp on the old T-stat all they wanted while I programmed the real one in my office to our building standards. Poof! Just like that, the complaints were reduced by 90%. Story 17. An app which scans barcodes to recognize items. It runs on Android and uses the device's camera to handle the scanning bit. The number of times the question is asked, is this supported on secure camera-less devices? Or, our devices don't have cameras, and they don't have a barcode scanner. Can the app still work? Story 18. Engineering coworker always told the story of when he used to work support at one of the leading electronic lab equipment, for example, oscilloscopes companies. Engineers would call or email when a piece of hardware stopped working, and the initial support advice was to ask the engineer to check the polarity on the power cable, just in case it was, plugged in incorrectly. Story 19. I'm in the process of turning my wood crafting hobby into a career, with every project I add to my portfolio. I've seen a lot of requests for desks that are so customized, they want everything that can't happen. They want an armrest where there's also a cup holder. They want a keyboard at this height while having the monitor at that height. All these impossible requests. I eventually sat down and thought to myself, if I was super lazy and didn't want to move from one spot, what would make for the perfect office desk? So I made one, got $150 from it. Story 20. Not my site, but a coworker's who gave us updates at our weekly oversight coordination meeting. Back in the summer of 2016, his construction site had a 60-foot pit on site, which was being excavated safely per all industry regs. However, it did not have 24H lighting, and there was minimal fencing around the edge. This was fine because they were only excavating during the day, and access to upper edge was blocked off and controlled, and the whole site was properly controlled and fenced off. All obligatory safety measures necessary were in play, and the laydown area was controlled. You know what else happened in the summer of 2016? Pokemon Go came out. There were 3 Pokestops on the site. He had to hire round-the-clock security so people wouldn't sneak onto the site in the middle of the night and die. Then it turns out people got clever. And you had groups where like 4 people would run diversion for security while they gave all their phones to another person, who would sneak onto the site in the middle of the night and run everyone's phone. So they had to hire more security to prevent this diversion tactic from working. Luckily, as everyone remembers, most people lost interest after a month and they stopped coming. When you're doing a risk plan, you think about schedule and budget. You don't think, what's my risk mitigation strategy for a breakout mobile game enticing idiots to accidentally dump their corpse on my work site? And how much money should I set aside to manage it? Story 21. Structural engineer. When designing a hand wheel for a door on a ship, we had to intentionally design the hand wheel to break before the shaft because we can't trust idiots to not spin it as hard as they possibly can, destroying the entire door in the process. Commenter. Watertight doors are heavy, so it's natural you want to close those wheels hard. Also, over time the dogs will either wear down or the spacing nuts move, causing them to need to be closed harder. All of this happens at different rates on a ship, so where the port door may be easy to close, the starboard one may need a little more effort. In theory, preventative maintenance keeps them all operating smoothly and correctly, but sometimes this just doesn't happen. Story 22. This was while I was in school for electrical engineering. The prof looked at us one day and said, "You can't make something 100% idiot-proof because the universe will just make a better idiot at the challenge." That has stuck with me since. Story 23. Structural engineering at an industrial facility. Switch to pipe or HSS for bracing, because anything made out of angle would be immediately torched out of the way if it ever got remotely close to anything maintenance wanted to work on, since it was just an angle iron. Story 24. A sound engineer asked me to assist him with a funeral home's need for variable music levels to subdue loud talking in the parlor. It may seem counterintuitive, but with sensors installed, as talking grew louder in the viewing room, the computer-adjusted music became softer. Likewise, when the room for the wake was hushed, the music became somewhat louder. The director said that most people lacked common sense, good manners, and didn't know how to behave by moderating their talking levels before an open coffin. The net effect of the music's variable volume helped to maintain an overall peaceful atmosphere conducive for those coming to the parlor to pay their last respects, according to the director's request. Story 25. Someone on our team everyone hyped up was the most unqualified person I've ever met. 8 years experience, and they openly admitted they cheated not just on their exams, but also their mask thesis. Anyways, this person didn't even know the basic equations for aerodynamics and aircraft performance. Couldn't code despite seeing the same code for years, and still couldn't use in-house tools that myself and 2 other new people learned in about 3 months on the job. This person also openly stole my presentations and work to show in group meetings. Even forgot to swap my name at the end slide once. We got so tired of doing their work and spoon-feeding them stuff, and the managers turning a blind eye to them and telling them stuff. They should have known that we actually ended up coding in error message prompts to clue them in when they got to the same questions. We answered millions of times. When that didn't click in, I actually coded in messages showing them which lines to go to find common issues. Guess what? 5 years of MATLAB and 14, they still couldn't use a debugger. I actually got personally so annoyed that I had certain error catches go to their printer and email to clue them in. I could go on for ages, but this was hands down the worst engineer I'll probably ever meet. The only thing this person was good at was sucking up to the right people and getting away with the most blatant disqualifications I'll ever see. Story 26. Not too exciting, but most of the real stupid proofing ends up in labeling. The real ridiculousness happens in the failure mode effect analysis, FMEA meetings. This is where you have to imagine every thinkable possible misuse, no matter how outlandish, and assign an occurrence score and severity score, then mitigate. These meetings bring out an infuriatingly creative side from your people, who are otherwise the most uncreative people in the office. Story 27. I worked on an old mainframe system that we'd so sufficiently idiot-proofed that the workers started just saying, if it'll let you do it, it must be okay, instead of understanding their processes. When we replaced that system, we found all sorts of things they'd been doing against policy, because no one knew it was against policy, and so no one told us to write a new catch to stop them from doing it. Then after we replaced the system, we basically had to replace everyone because they kept just doing whatever the new system would allow. Except the new system had none of those checks. So we had a few months where literally nothing was in line with policy. We had to try to explain to them that it was literally their jobs to know what the policy was and enforce it. Story 28. I've been designing complex systems for 16 plus years. I could write a book on this subject. There's always some level of moaning and groaning when a system you designed goes through the risk assessment process. And people point out, we need extra guarding here, and here, and here, and there, and here. One time, I had to add 8 of light curtains to the front of a system so that operators can't get a running start and jump through the opening to the machine. I called that the Superman rule, which is in excess of all OSHA requirements. The sad part of that one is that someone did indeed Superman through while the system was running, which promptly mangled them and nearly cut them in half. Yes, they died. We had all of our documentation in line, and every box was checked, so it was ruled as an intentional circumvention of established safety devices. On another system, I had to design in an automated cup holder for operators, complete with a through-beam sensor. Why? Operators were known to throw garbage and pour drinks into systems to create downtime so they could get more break time, while maintenance was fixing the machine that mysteriously broke. The cup holders would only release people's drinks during designated break times. I had a little PTSD when I played Wolfenstein New Colossus in the level where you have to intentionally break your machine to stage a distraction in prison. The worst one I ever sat through in terms of seriously, what kind of idiot would, was when I was designing a system for a certain auto manufacturer. It was a large system that was responsible for assembling and welding all sorts of variants across the entire lineup of $100,000 vehicles. The components being welded were held in place by spring-loaded pins with complex geometries. I spent a considerable amount of time designing the pins so that you couldn't load them incorrectly, matching the geometry of the mating part. These poke yokes were expensive to begin with. After about a month of the system running at the customer's facility, the customer wanted me to add additional poke yoke features to the pins so they couldn't be installed in the wrong location and wrong machine. The fact that the part geometries wouldn't line up if you put the wrong pin in the wrong place was irrelevant. Certain operators were ramming these things into the wrong holes and causing system crashes. Mind you, this takes serious effort to do, to the point of cracking the parts. So, across 9 of these systems, which I designed, I had to have 63 unique pin designs. I accomplished this by having slots machined in and clocked in certain orientations, so they were essentially keys at this point and cost upwards of $1,500 each to machine. Hardened pins and locating dies. Hard stuff. A few weeks later, all of the pins were machined, assembled, and delivered to the customer. I got a phone call that same week and was told, "You need to get here. We can't run the systems." I got in my car, drove out to meet the customer. Their executive director was standing in the lobby waiting for me. We walked out to the systems, and I was told that my design jammed up the systems and is holding up production for the entire vehicle line, costing $30,000 per minute. We walked up to the first system, and sure enough, the pins were completely stuck in the dies. What the hell? I designed these things with a 0.003 inches gap. It should be smooth like butter, and I tested everyone myself before we shipped them. Every pin was jammed. The director was furious. I pulled up the assembly drawings and proved that the designs and tolerances were sound. I couldn't pull these things out, but I noticed the tops of the pins were crowned over, like someone had been smashing them with a 5-pound sledge. We continued walking through to the other systems, and as we approached one, we heard a banging sound. Their maintenance lead was standing in front of one of the systems, with a large hammer, absolutely wailing the pins in place. The director grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around, and said, "What are you doing?" The maintenance guy said, "The pins don't fit." I picked up one of the pins he hadn't mashed, showed him the keyed feature, pointed out the engraved ID on the corresponding receiver die, and demonstrated that they fit absolutely perfectly fine when you mate them with the correct assembly. Oh, and it was color and number coded too. The director turned to me, said, "Quote me a new set," and stormed off. Story 29. Way back when, I designed a product that had an optional battery module that was meant to connect to a main module. To assemble the battery module to the main module, you had to put the round peg in the round hole and the square peg in the square hole. That's it. I even put a ducking sticker with instructions on the back on the battery module. Even so, we still had around 1% of clients that couldn't figure it out this puzzle. One particular client had used a hammer to force the module together the wrong way. Another had tried to solder wires through the holes and pegs. Another didn't understand that he had to connect the battery module to the main module for the former to power the latter. You can't engineer around stupid. There's no worst case. It goes all the way down past 0 to minus infinity. Story 30. Software engineer, sort of. Made parts of a website to let the customer decide where they would like holes in our product. Did not realize customers would fill in a hole with a diameter of 0 every 0 mm. So no hole was made, and the air supply it was supposed to give did not work very well. Now they can no longer pick 0, it has to be more, and added an extra button in case someone actually did not need holes. Story 31. Not an engineer, but I worked it in a plant with some creative individuals. One of the machines was a press of sorts. You slid a sheet of metal off a conveyor and into the left side of the machine. Then you stepped 6 feet to your right to press the start button. Normally you'd use 2 people to run a machine like this, but we really didn't use it often. And when we did, it was a sort of 2 dozen, get them done by lunch affair. Nice and relaxed. Anyway, one fine Friday, the plant manager notices a fiberglass paint pole with a couple of loops of shoelace tied to it leaning on the machine. Curious as to how the operator was using said pole, he waited a bit out of sight for the man to arrive. First, the pole was stuck through a bit of safety cage. Then the first loop was strung over the start switch. The second loop was slung over the railing, creating, in effect, a 7-foot-long lever the operator could use to push the start button with. The pole was instantly taken away and the operator written up. The operator tried again, this time with a bit of nylon strapping, some paracord, and a pair of carabiners. This had the advantage of being easily hidden when not in use. This too was caught in short order and the operator written up again. One more like that and he'd be gone. Still, the plant manager wanted to make sure it never happened again. So he installed a pressure switch under a rubber mat at the operator's station. If you weren't standing on it, the machine wouldn't start. The operator was caught again with the carabiner or paracord or strap contraption. How'd he defeats the pressure switch? A large lunchbox filled with concrete. You better bet he was fired. But the plant manager wasn't done. This creative individual wasn't the only one on the crew, so he one-upped the pressure sensor by installing a bit of steel and some blocks over it. Trial and error showed that the lunchbox wouldn't trigger it anymore, nor would a bucket have filled with sand, but a full-grown man would. The fix was promptly forgotten about for years and years. Until one day we get a complaint that the machine wasn't starting up reliably, and that the operator sometimes had to hit the button 2 or 3 times, with violence, to get the machine going. I go out to have a quick look and see if it's something simple before calling in the plant manager. The operator could only get it to start half the time, and my 5 or 6 attempts failed every time. The plant manager couldn't reproduce the problem. Another day, another complaint. This time we both went down, the plant manager sticking a continuity probe into the circuit and me pressing the button. Nada. Then the light went on. Manager: I got it. How much do you weigh? Me: 155 pounds. Why? Manager: and you? Operator: Operator: you should never ask a woman her weight or her age. Manager: I need to know. Your weight, please? Operator: quietly: 165. Manager: and you've lost about 10 or 15 pounds on your current diet, right? Operator: I swear I'm going to IR the moment we're done here. Manager, laughing: there's a pressure plate under the mat. You've lost enough weight, it doesn't trigger reliably anymore, that's all. Once you lose another 10 pounds, it won't trigger at all, so I'm going to just disable it. Story 32. Many years ago, I somehow became the owner of the software that was used to print out labels that would be applied to our two-way radios, pagers, etc. There were 4 to 8 labels that would give details on frequencies, details on the batteries, etc. But if the radio was going to Japan, a few of them were not to be applied. Operators were trained for this, but would too often make mistakes because there was a label with numbers and writing on it. Applying it was a quality defect, which was closely monitored. To fix it, an engineer asked me to not print the information for the Japan radios. That would produce a blank label, which should alert people not to apply it to the radio. A few months later, a quality defect appeared where someone had applied a blank label. The engineer called me back and asked if we can put "do not apply" on the labels instead of leaving it blank. I thought for a bit and said that some operator is going to apply the label that says "do not apply" anyway. Plus, we would have to print it in about 7 languages. He agreed and went off to figure out a different way to deal with it. Story 33. Software engineer. The number of times I've had to explain that backwards compatibility can't exist for a new feature is astounding. Usually this has come in the form of new hardware is getting released and new software is written to support said hardware. Customers complain that old software, written before new hardware existed, doesn't behave well with the new hardware and make a stink about needing to upgrade the software or having to update clients as well as servers or some other ridiculous thing. Story 34. The stupid proofing I've had to do for engineers in my company is probably only combated by the same they've had to do for me, I bet. Now, when I train people, I say, when you make guides, assume you're talking to a person who doesn't know even the most basic things. Don't write, execute command blah blah. Take a screenshot, circle the bar, and type in XYZ and click enter. and so on. Same thing goes for physical things. Surely they'd shut the valve off before. No, they wouldn't do duck all if it's not written explicitly in the manual, and maybe even then. On one hand, it's a bit annoying to make things stupid proof, but the way I think of it is, we all have brain freeze moments. The longer time it takes us to engineer a part or write a guide to make a process simpler is worth it if one distracted employee doesn't get hurt or make a mistake that could have been avoided. Story 35. Mechanical engineer working in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning here. I have a contractor firm that always loses the mechanical plans when we send them out. To mitigate this, I send the plans over to the primary and his boss, as well as upload them to an online cloud where they keep their plans for the projects. I've started to CC their secretary as well as label the folders, plans in here. I still get weekly panic calls from them saying they can't find the plans for different projects, and I just face palm every time. Story 36. Software engineer here. In the organization, which I previously used to work their business model, was based on supply chain. It was very hard to explain technical limitations to non-technical product managers, mostly of operations side. I sometimes used to explain them by relating to everyday things, like explaining server or any resource as a pot or something which has a limited capacity. And you cannot fill more water/serve more requests than that. It was kind of fun. I remember once I explained them horizontal and vertical scaling by taking example of train and bus. You can attach more coaches to train to handle more requests. That's horizontal scaling was as you need to hire a large bus to accommodate more people that vertical. Story 37. Long before the eponymous Murphy installed a set of sensors backwards so they didn't work. R. Buckminster Fuller wrote an essay in prose form about control by adequate design of misuse. The short name for the process is doesn't proofing. Working in a customer-facing position, just engineering a space so people are able to figure out how to navigate, it is impossible. You can design for 98%, but there's always a persistent 2% that will actively thwart everything you put in place to prevent their blunderings. Even if you literally stand at the door and tell each person personally what to do, not do, or expect, 2% will immediately ask or do the opposite of what you just said and get all agitated at you at the results. Case in point, when COVID hit, the office at my auto shop closed and all business was done outside. I put up 3-day glow neon-colored signs saying not to enter the office. Months into the shutdown, huge numbers of people were still going in. So I started an experiment to see if there was a number of signs that was enough to get the 98% up to 99.5%. Every time someone went in, I added another do not enter sign. It got up to 9 signs before I gave up and took down all but the original 3 before losing the last shreds of hope for humanity. There were signs taped over the door handle you'd have to grasp and wrinkle. Didn't matter. A chair placed in front of the door, again with 2 bright do not enter signs you'd have to grasp to move the chair. 2 pictograms, and even a blow-up of a Gandalf, "You shall not pass," meme. The same persistent 2% could not be swayed or changed. When I went to Mother's Day brunch with my mom right after her county first reopened for outdoor dining, she did the same thing, and I wanted to explode. The hostess told us, "We're going to walk through the restaurant to the outdoor patio now." My brother and I walked through, but my mom stopped in the doorway and spun around, causing the hostess girl to have to jump back and catch the door again, and says in an annoying sing-song voice, at a casual conversational pace, "Oh, so I guess we're eating inside." Story 38. At one of my internships, I was called Bollard Man, because I personally installed over 50 bollards around the plant within 3 months in response to people nearly destroying expensive things. I think some operators think it's a personal challenge to see what they can get to fit between bollards and park and hazard zones. For the outdoor areas, I started reading into defensive architecture designs to come up with protective designs that don't actually look like bollards. Methods like planting trees and bushes, adding drainage ditches, decorative boulders, picnic benches, street lamps, walls, and so on. The kicker being, I'm an electrical engineer. It's not even remotely in my job description. I've just learned that there is just no amount of signage and warnings to convince people that even though you can't see the megawatts of power flowing through the equipment, they are in fact quite deadly if damaged or misused. Story 39. I used to work as a mechanical designer at an automation company. We built pallet dispensers for warehouses. They are a big metal box where a forklift will load 80 pallets into them as a double stack, and the machine spits them out 2 at a time at the bottom for all the picking trucks. The dispenser was bolted to the floor. Anyway, we get a warranty complaint. The mounting bolts are broken and it keeps moving. Huh? Turns out the warehouse guys weren't slowing down to get pallets from the machine, but ramming it and using it as a brake. It was at the end of a corridor, so they had a nice long run up. We had to turn the machine 90 dags so they couldn't build up speed and double the number of lag bolts and up the size. Story 40. Architect here. Designing a food cold storage facility which needed auto-opening while closing doors between 22 DGC storage chamber and loading bay. Doors are for forklift access. Forklifts are very good at destroying doors. Worked with Ford truck manufacturer considering max speed in a straight line. Designed system of barriers at 90 degrees to doors to channel the trucks to the doors in a controlled corridor. Had photocell at start of barrier, induction loop, and floor and radar above door. Length of barriers from door was such that truck could not travel length of barrier even at full speed and arrive at door without the door having opened due to any or all of the 3 triggering sensor mechanisms. And we added in a big safety factor. And the trucks had to turn 90 DEG to get between barriers, so they weren't even at full speed when they triggered the first sensor. Took 2 days to get a door destroyed. Story 41. A grad-level lab supervisor poorly cleaned a chem station and proceeded to eat his lunch at that station. The previous students working on that station were working with a cyanide compound. The lab supervisor suffered, but didn't die. During a company freeze, a systems architect fat-fingered a script and pushed a global software update that forced a reboot to all domain servers internationally during a live demo of a product to board of investors. This is one of my top favorites. A director level constantly complained about slow laptop. Security team advised him to stop going to suspicious sites, in which he angrily yelled at them that all he does is work while he is home. Then the IT team would have to re-image his laptop. This happened about 5 times. Then the director of security got involved, and in front of everyone showed how he was watching porn from multiple shady sites, and exactly when he clicked on Start Webcam Show, he got infected. He thought cleaning his history was enough to hide his footsteps. By the way, if you work for a top 50 Fortune 500 companies, you sign off all your data privacy rights when using it equipment. There are many advanced tracking software that tracks every single character you type, every website you go to. Clearing cookies, history, will not help. There are rules to protect your privacy to a certain degree. But if the company ever needs to create a case against you or to collect proof, they can fully audit you so easily. I'm no longer in this field, but I will tell you, there are so many sick PPL out there. Story 42. Electrical engineer in the building industry. Started putting wiring diagrams on the blueprints for how to wire emergency lighting battery packs because sometimes when I did an inspection, I would find lights that either never turned off or would go into emergency mode and drain the battery every time you turned off the lights because someone was too stupid to not read the simple instructions that came with the battery pack. Story 43. Took the physical disable Wi-Fi button off laptops, clearly marked, but people would still flip it and wonder why their Wi-Fi went off. That company had a policy for who got which kind of laptops. Devs, IT top-end, sales small and light, project managers mid-range, everyone else low-end if you could get one at all since it required special approval. A couple of weeks after supergluing all of those switches, I realized that Jackass was really trying to get an upgrade from PM to Dev IT laptop, or at least a new PM laptop, and was submitting tickets just to show that his was broken and he needed a new one. He started submitting other tickets about slow and crashing. His was like 3 years old and he was annoyed that new PMs had better PM laptops. Not to say that the Wi-Fi switch wasn't a problem. People were accidentally flipping it at times, but this jackass was doing it intentionally. Commenter. I used superglue to jam one user switch in the on position since he could not follow instructions regarding not touching the switch. He complained that he could no longer turn Wi-Fi off to my boss. Boss came to me and said, "Why?" I showed him the 2 or 3 tickets a week for Wi-Fi not connecting from that one user. Boss noticed all the other similar tickets and said, "Superglue all of them." Story 44. Many moons ago, I managed a support function in cybersecurity that included a sysadmin group. They had gotten lazy and were repurposing laptops throughout the organization without properly updating them and removing the previous user's files first. So, I had them go through a 2-step process of wiping the laptop and putting on a fresh build from corporate to make sure they were up to date and didn't include any prior users' data. We built custom boot disks that were to be used for the wiping. They were printed on orange blank DVDs, which we paid extra for. They were only available to sysadmin staff. The staff were explicitly told, and writing was on the disk, to never boot a machine with the disk unless the intent was to wipe the machine and start from scratch. And the scripted process had several very loud and garish screens warning, "This will delete the entire hard drive irreversibly. Do you want to continue?" Despite all of this, we were forced by audit to have the machines log on to the corporate network first, and then query the sysadmin for their SSO password before wiping the machine. Why? Because despite all that, 3 machines had been inadvertently wiped. Those people are the reason you get warnings on Windex bottles. Story 45. I'm not an engineer, but a heavy equipment mechanic. We have one very big garage door on the side of our building. There are 2 large signs on either side of the door in English and Chinese, big customer base, that say, "Do not enter." A line painted on the ground that says, "Stop, do not enter in it." A 4 feet x 10 feet orange sign that says, Customer, with arrows pointing to the front of the building, with arrows painted on the ground also going to the front of the building, and a chain that hangs across the doorway with another sign that says staff only. I wish I was kidding when I tell you that even with all that, at least 2 people a day walk into the shop and are genuinely surprised when they're confronted. Story 46. We had the side doors to our office refitted with keypads to make it easier for employees to go in and out while still maintaining a locked egress point. People would move the interior handle to keep the door unlocked so they wouldn't have to input their code. They would leave it unlocked at night, causing security issues. So I put tape on the lock and a note saying, "Leave door locked for security reasons." 2 days later, I see tape moved and door unlocked. I then hot glue the lock and put tape on it with another note. Door is to remain locked as per company policy. Failure to do so will result in disciplinary action. 2 days later, tape is moved and hot glue has been dug out. Word is manager on that side of building authorized employee to open the lock again. Now I'm pissed. Respect auto hide. I take a chisel and hammer the lock portion into the body of the door handle. Super glue the interior. Encase outside in epoxy. Cover in tape and place a note on door. Failure to abide by company policy has forced this. Any attempt to bypass the closing and locking of this door will be met with termination by owner's name. 2 days later, there is a ducking block holding the door ajar, which I noticed when I left late and saw light coming out of door. I bolted the ducking door shut, had all fire exit signs moved, and told fire inspectors it was due to structural damage. Story 47. Worked on the railroad and the safety rules are crazy sometimes. Imagine every time someone get hurt, they make a new rule or try to prevent it in other ways. No room for common sense or logic. So electric trains run on those power lines above the track. Scary angry pixies live in the power lines. And of course, some people want to meet them or do by mistake when climbing a train. So one year they decide, we need yellow danger signs everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Not just trains and wagons, but every power line post, 60 meter apart, feet x3, every bridge, and they all need cleaning. As to the engineering, every kind of post needs its own design, depending on the dimensions of the post, materials like iron, galvanized, concrete, plastic spacers, and grounding to avoid buildup from the magnetic field. A sticker is not good enough for the world of bored railroad engineers. Most could be installed with the same new tension-perfect installment tool they invented, so that's something. Maybe one day, this saves a life, and all the time installing and cleaning these signs will be worth it. But I bet the guy is going to earn his Darwin Award some other way. Story 48. Our head engineer would be sent off to other companies in the group to troubleshoot problems for them that they couldn't solve. One of his sites had a problem of red plastic pieces in the finished product, like plastic bag material. He's flown from Europe to Asia to investigate. It was a powder mix that was being created by blending other powders together. He gets to site. They show him the end of the line where this red stuff is coming out in the product. Naturally, he goes to the start of the process to work his way through eliminating causes. First thing he sees at the start of the line is a worker chucking bags of ingredient into one of the hoppers. The bags were red and plastic. He takes a closer look. They've built a shredding mechanism on top of the hopper so that the worker just has to chuck the bag in the hopper and the shredder will rip it open. This logic here was to save time not having to open the bags. He asked the site manager if they were having him on, taking the piss. They weren't. They literally couldn't connect the dots that this was the source of the red plastic pieces. The solution was to stop doing that. Haha. Story 49. One of our manufacturing engineers was tired of production workers using expensive air tools as hammers. So he drilled a hole in the base of a wood-handled hammer and glued in an air connector. Having them hook it up to air and be amazed at how good it performed was amazing. Story 50. A decade ago, I was a structural engineering intern. I designed a column pedestal for a prefab steel building, and I think the most economical design was a 16 inches x 18 inches pedestal. My boss says to me, make it 18 inches x 18 inches so they can't orient it wrong by accident. And I think that's the thing from that internship that I still think about the most. Story 51. Systems engineer here, probably the least bona fide professional posting, but I've got some stories. Around 2009, I was working a contract to upgrade an unstable system. Bad-minded admins were shutting down high-availability servers whenever something went wrong. The upgrade was already bought by the time I arrived, and the system was overdue despite the following narrative. Overall, my perspectives and very presence were met with resistance, and I didn't have time to teach them why reading logs is a good thing or how to begin doing so. At first, I removed the start menu options to shut down or restart on several relevant servers, only to find that they were using the chassis power buttons all along. So I figured out how to make the boxes appear to turn off, but not actually shut down. They'd press the power button, and it would turn off the screen and do nothing else for 60 seconds. The button presses just sent me an email to advise me of their ersatz solution, run the blank screensaver, and count to 60. At 61, it would turn the screen back on. Again, these weren't end users. These were administrators. There were many reasons why this shouldn't have worked, why this ruse should have been obvious. The only direct feedback I recall getting from their team was that it seemed faster. Good times. Story 52. I was on a team that developed a tool to help our org runs tests efficiently. This was for a large part of the org, 1,000. SW details aren't important, but we did our own support. Devs hate doing support. So with each email, we would always commit something to ensure we would never get that email again. Bug fix, feature tweak, unit test, system test, build system, etc. At first, we dealt with the first adopters. These guys were heroes going above and beyond to help us find problem. Smart guys wanting to help make our stuff work for them. They helped us help them. Then came the next larger cohort. But because we kept fixing things, the support load was constant, even as our user base scaled up. We had such success that the whole org was running our tool dozens of times a day each. It was a thing of beauty. It was such a well-oiled machine that our 5-man team still handled support ourselves. But the problem is, we made the tool so user-friendly, the problem so self-correcting, so flexible and plug-enable, that the only people who ever emailed us were the world's greatest idiots. We had distilled the pool of users into a fine goop of purified stupidity. It was the curse of success. Story 53. Instrument guy here. We had a chemical contact chamber with a very complex cascade control system. There were about a dozen controllers interacting and indicating. The head operator would constantly adjust us and screw up the process. Eventually, we decided to shut the whole system off and just use one analyzer, one valve, and one controller because it worked better. Before we put the thing back in service, we wired the controller outputs so the meters jump around when the operator turns the AS. None of it did anything. He would go every day and move S and watch meters until he eventually retired. We set the only working controller at the correct set point and put an out-of-service label on it. Story 54. In university, I had to take a safety course, and the professor told us, "Every warning is there because someone passed away because of it. Please don't be responsible for the next one. Thanks." Story 55. I worked on a system that required users to create their own account using the username and password from another system. I have since changed the process wherein I create the account for them using a simpler login procedure. I had one guy that could not type in his password the same way twice to save his life. He tried to create the account and failed. We took him over to the engineers of the main system. It took him literally about 20 tries before he could type in the password twice the same way to reset his password. He then came to my office to create his account in my subsystem and failed. We did this 3 times. He would spend several minutes trying to type in a password the same way twice before succeeding, and then he failed. Finally, I changed his password in the main system myself. Then I created his account for him, using the password I created for him. Then I dropped him off at the main help desk and told them to reset his password again for him. I don't know if he did or not. I left. My part was done, and I was done with the situation. Story 56. Outside plant engineer here. In 1996, we were put on an all-hands Fix Utah project. The Olympics were coming, and all of Utah's planners and engineers were working on that. And we were to pick up the slack on the day-to-day jobs that needed to be worked. I had finished one job, a simple buried straight-line copper distribution, no big deal. I finished it up, and they told me to run it by Randy, the senior OSP engineer from Utah. I got the job back with a note to allocate money for custom armored plating for the pedestals, the green ugly things in your front or backyards. Why? Because apparently the locals use them for target practice, and the armor had to withstand a direct hit from a 30.06. Never had to do that anywhere else I worked, but I haven't worked everywhere yet. Story 57. Not an engineer, but worked for a fireplace company when they had to start adding big stickers on our gas and wood fireplaces that say, paraphrased but not far off, "Caution, fireplace extremely hot when in use." They were sued all the time for people getting burned, for things such as, but not limited to, touching burning logs, fireplace tools sold separately, allowing children to place hand on fireplace glass, gas, melting, breaking TVS that were mounted on top without proper clearances, hardware, burning house down, or other damage from admitted misuse. To give some context to the last one, storing dry wood in front of the fireplace, storing camp fuel in plastic containers in front of fireplace, changed log placement, gas, then discovered soot all over their room. You must do it the way they say, period. Tried to use the wrong gas type. There are many more, but it got me the most. There are folks out there who don't realize that fire is hot. Story 58. Just in general, the insane size and quantity of warning labels that have to be all over everything like a riding lawnmower. If you don't know that blades are sharp, mufflers are hot, and you shouldn't stick your hand into moving belts, you have to be a real idiot. To be fair, it's mainly so that if you do hurt yourself, the corporate lawyers can say, "We told you not to do that," but it ruins the aesthetics of a lot of equipment. Moreover, It causes people to ignore things that should actually be warnings. Because now the paradigm is that every warning is just painfully obvious bias. Story 59. I'm a chemical engineer and designed a small system that went onto a customer site to test a process. One day, the customer wanted to do a photo shoot to show of the new kit. The system includes a lot of pumps, and each has an independent motor drive mounted next to it with a small lead screen. When turned off, this screen reads stop. Now the process had not yet finished commission and was empty and not hooked up to anything except electricity. An important fact is that you should never run a pump without liquid. It will destroy the rotating parts. PR lady did not like the stop on all the screens, so asked a technician to turn them on. I had told this guy beforehand it is empty and basically just for show. He told her this, but she ignored it and told him to do it anyway. Next day, I get a phone call saying the entire thing is broke and spewing smoke from all the burnt rubber in the pumps. Story 60. A teacher in high school loved to tell this anecdote when we got into programming and best practices. Always assume the dumbest possible user. Once you're done programming, try to intentional brick everything and find ways to stop yourself. Our school had a library that was operated by volunteers, usually people's moms. They had a small desk with a PC at the entrance to log stuff and help kids print out things and such. Cue, one day some kid asks one of them to print something from his USB stick, and what happened next must have traumatized this little guy for the rest of his life. The mom somehow managed to force the USB stick into the floppy drive with so much force that our IT teachers had to take the PC apart to get the USB back. The floppy drive didn't make it. Idiot proofing was basically that there no longer was a floppy drive to violate, and that new library moms would now also get training on how to use a USB stick, including how to identify a USB port. Story 61. Back in the day, I was an IT engineer in the Army. I was given the task to write procedures that anyone could follow. I spent a couple days on the procedure to ghost, reset laptops that had been in the field. The Sarge got this guy to test it without any help. First step was connect the laptop to the switch with an Ethernet cable and confirm the light goes green dipstick, use two separate unconnected cables, and tried for 30 minutes to work out why the light wasn't green. He had 6 months of it training. At this point, Sarge turned to me and said, "You failed," and walked out laughing. Story 62. Designed a wireless industrial data collection system. I got the cost down to under $5 a unit with good supply lines. It's not a consumer product, is about the size of a power adapter, and is never meant to be seen or serviced unless it breaks. It was a solid engineering victory. Went and bought different colored cases because I predicted the CEO would ask why it didn't come in different colors, then make us go back to the drawing board. It did in fact happen, and I had several cases ready. I pointed out that the black one looked the best, and he bought it. Fortunate, because the supplier only made black and beige cases, and they were all out of beige. So I idiot-proofed a project proposal by adding colorful case options to the prototype. Was a nice little Dilbert moment. Story 63. Not engineer, but chemist. We had a major problem of field techs acting careless with concentrated acids and packing the boxes with the grace and care of disgruntled airline employees. The kind of acid that you dip a paper towel in, then the paper blackens and turns to ash, kind of concentrated. I was in charge of packing and unpacking chemicals for field work, and it had gotten to the point where strongly worded company-wide emails were a weekly occurrence almost. We spent time and money modifying coolers with custom-made foam inserts and bought refillable bottles. We even, and I'm scared that this was a necessity, designed those coolers so that if you store a bottle upside ducking down the lid, will not close. Yes, because this has happened several times. The bottom of one boxer was corroded to nearly its breaking point, and I was extremely lucky I noticed the damage before it gave, and bottles of acid crashed to my feet. Story 64. Not me personally, but in a different module in a factory I used to work in, a guy stuck his hands into a heated acid vat to grab material he had dropped. His PPE saved him from chemical burns, but he did end up with second-degree burns. I saw their module's process engineer walking around our area and looking at the acid vats. He said he was considering putting up "Don't stick your hands in the acid" signs up, and we joked about no swimming signs instead. Story 65. Civil engineer here. I had a project which involved the removal of 3 very old, very grand oak trees. The city zoning department's condition for removal of the trees was that the wood be preserved and used to make conference tables for the business college building being constructed on the site. We did all of the legwork for the contractor. I spent weeks coordinating how big the pieces should be, where to store the pieces, how to cut them, even went so far as to put a phone number on the plans for the person at the college who would be responsible for moving and storing the wood after the trees were cut down. The contractor cut the trees down and immediately fed them through the wood chipper. Story 66. Maybe not the most ridiculous, but might be my favorite story. We used a nuclear level sensor to measure how full a hopper was in a highly flammable environment. so we didn't need to cut any penetrations in the side of the system and potentially leak solvent vapor. The nuclear source in these systems is encased in a heavy-duty lead box. We had to add a half-inch thick stainless steel shroud around the back of the source after we walked in one morning to find hammer marks all along the outside of the box. The hopper had accumulated some buildup during the night, and the operator couldn't think of a better place to pound on to break it up than the nuclear source. Story 67. Ever remove a computer case and find a burrito in it? One of the workers would hide his food in the case because they weren't supposed to have food at their workstation. Well, he must have forgot it because we opened this computer that wasn't booting up properly to a full biome of insect life, and what I think was green and black mold growing over the motherboard. We chucked it. Guy who it was assigned to get fired because he already had several warnings for spilling drinks on peripherals or leaving crumbs around his workstation. Who puts a burrito in a computer and forgets it? Burritos are delicious. Also, computer innards are dusty. Don't put food in there. Story 68. X is a civil engineer. He had to go to court because one of the trash truck workers wouldn't stop eating the salt they laid out for snow. He literally had to go and talk about why it isn't safe to eat and how he'd put up literature saying as much. The lady kept eating it, got sick, and tried to sue the city. She tried to say that working was making her eat it unintentionally, but nobody rides on the back of the truck when they are spreading salt. She was going back there and eating it in her own. She also got caught on camera eating it back at the base. Story 69. I'm not an engineer, but I can relate to this. Was working on a website redesign in 2020, and one of our head salespeople providing input for a specific market told us to include something above the fold to tell people to scroll down. Our whole dev team ignores this request because who needs to be told to scroll down? We now have a header that says scroll down for more resources because people seriously could not figure it out. Story 70. Marine engineer here. Power tools are constantly going missing from our workshop. There are only 10 people that have access to them. It drives my boss mad. He's always kicking off about things going missing. I suggested a sign-out and sheet for the expensive stuff to him and to restrict who has access to the keys. His response? I'm not using a sign-out sheet. You are all grown men and can look after tools. A week later, 2 more drills have gone missing and he's done nothing but complain that we can't look after our tools properly. Guess what? He's now suggested a sign-out or in sheet, which was of course his idea. Story 71. Visited a machine shop once. They were finishing up a machined replacement part to replace a cast OM part. For reference, cast parts don't have as good strength properties compared to a full machined part from a forging, but they can be cheaper, faster to make if you already have the tooling. So this shop was essentially making a better version of the OM part that was no longer available. They had machined fake casting lines into the part so it would look the same because the customer complained was concerned it would look different than the OM part they were duplicating. Hi. These lines are causes by the split in the 2 halves of the casting die. They serve no purpose. The machine shop had to put them in to make their part look cheaper. Story 72. Boss shared a story about how they had to make their no-step stickers on agriculture equipment, places you should not step, textured and more grippy because people sued after slipping on them. Story 73. I work for a company that manufactures control valves. We commonly use solenoid valves as an accessory item to actuate the valve. Occasionally, our control valves are installed very close together on skids, so there's hardly any room to get at the equipment. Nipple mounting. The solenoid valves is more economical, but my boss told me, no, you're definitely going to want to bracket mount those solenoids. Technicians will step on the solenoids to get at the other valves on the skid, and if they're nipple mounted, they'll break. Not too unreasonable, but not something I would have thought to do on my own. Story 74. I build test equipment to test high voltage devices. 90% of the buttons on the control boxes are nothing more than a key line through switches to keep the idiot's hand off the components they are testing. Completely unnecessary for the actual automated test. Story 75. When I was a field engineer for an automation firm, we had to install a light curtain, industrial version of the laser tripwires you see in heist movies, around the base of a hydraulic scissor lift. Apparently, they had a similar system at another plant where some dude thought that hiding under that lift to take a nap was a great idea. Yes, the system was running. No, he did not wake up before it came back down. Story 76. Customers now have to sign the proposal, sign the scope of work page, and sign the exclusions page as well. Then they sign something that says they attended a meeting where all these things were explained. 10% still get mad when the job doesn't include the 5.436 extra things they think it should. Story 77. I had to idiot-proof a UPS because of a terrible design rather than idiot users. The power button was on the front at hip height and stood out from the surface. So if anyone bumped into it, the room instantly went eerily quiet. What idiot designed that? We made a thick plate with a button-sized hole in it so you could lean on it all you liked, but anything smaller than a fingertip wasn't going in. Story 78. I had to make a warning label for a large industrial rip saw I designed. which explained that the DC injection brake wouldn't work if you turned off the main disconnect. The label was in response to someone turning off the main disconnect, sticking their hands in the saw blade pit without looking, and cutting off a few fingers. Apparently, looking at the blade to see if it was still spinning was too much to ask. Story 79. I drive. Deal with fire trucks. As I train people who will drive, operate them, I tell them, see all these warning labels plastered all over this unit? Well, that's because it happened. Don't stick your fingers in the fan belts, fall off the unit, or ram the ladder into power lines. When we have these vehicles built, the manufacturers follow national guidelines, not rules. A stroke of a pen, and we can bypass those guidelines. Story 80. I have yet to find proper idiot-proofing. I have even seen engineers ignore such simple instructions. I have created documents where the most common questions are all answered in the first 2 sentences in the document. I'm not kidding, the first 2 sentences. Even after giving them this document, they come back days later, why isn't this working? Because you didn't read the document proceeds to share screen and show them the steps live and then show the document. Oh yeah, story 81. When designing hardware for the exterior of the ISS, you're prohibited from making anything with holes of a certain size so that the astronauts don't get their fingers stuck. Story 82. I cannot stress enough utterly impossible it is to idiot-proof a device or process. The idiots are getting upgraded faster than Samsung cell phones. I'm a manufacturing engineer, and I honestly don't even try to idiot-proof processes anymore. I try to minimize the damage when someone inevitably ducks something up, and I make sure we have spare parts for everything critical. It's the best I've been able to do. Story 83. Drainage design engineer here. We now have to put pool fencing above outlet head walls, where water come out of a pipe, because someone stuck their arse through a rail fence to do a poo into the fast-moving water. They fell through the fence and into the water. Story 84. Every computer at my previous workplace had stickers stating, "Do not strike with hammer." We are skilled auto technicians, but some of us are old school when it comes to troubleshooting.